So we've been looking at the nature of enlightenment. Useful information, right, to help us approach the goal. We want to make sure we're heading in the right direction. And when we're thinking about a subject like enlightenment, it's very obscure, perhaps, to us. We're not really sure what it means, what it would look like, what it would feel like. I'm sure if we asked everyone in the room, we get very different responses. And of course, the Buddha had to try and explain this to people. So he developed ways of talking about enlightenment that could be understood. I mean, if you think about it, something like enlightenment is really beyond words, right? Even the practice of meditation is beyond words, right? Can you imagine the subtlety that is required to talk about something as profound as enlightenment? You know, sometimes when people come and they talk about their practice, it's incredibly challenging for them to put into words the experiences that they've had. There's no words for meditation, really. We can only approximate it in our language. And so this is why the Buddha developed so many wonderful similes to help explain deep and complicated concepts in ways that could be easily understood by ordinary people like us. And he would often say, it's by way of a simile that a smart person can understand the topic. And so when we start looking in the suttas, we find that there are similes everywhere. And of course, think about the culture at the time of the Buddha. There was no photographs, no videos. There was only words filling up the space, right? And he had to make his talks visual so that they could be remembered. When he uses similes, it's to help people see the concepts. And often he would use similes from people's daily lives. If he's talking to farmers, he'll talk about farming. If he's talking to a community of fire-worshipping ascetics, then he talks about fire. If he's talking to a community of, let's say, people who work with money, he talks about wealth and accumulation and things like that. So he talks about these in terms of similes with those people to help them understand. Some of these can become a bit confusing 2,500 years later, but most of them are actually still easy to understand. And tonight perhaps I'll talk about the hindrances and some of the similes he used to describe the hindrances, which are so potent. They really help us understand and can transform the way we see those topics. So he also had to talk about Nibbana, and there's a series of similes that I wanted to look at today. We're going to skip the first one, so we're looking at session 3 on Saturday at 3 p.m, because we're running a bit late. So I'm going to just skip this long list. The Buddha was very good at creating listicles. So he created a long list. Some of these, I just mentioned them briefly. We've already heard some of them: peaceless, deathless, sublime, state of grace, sanctuary. These are wonderful terms, but perhaps they need some extra explanation to understand. And so we'll just skip to one of the most beautiful similes the Buddha came up with to describe Nibbana, which is like a flame being extinguished. And this is something that we find in the Ratana Sutta, which is one of the famous Parita, one of the protection suttas. And so there's just a little bit of confusion here for us English speakers 2,500 years later, using a word like enlightenment, right? Talk about the light coming on. But when the Buddha talked about Nibbana, Nibbana means to turn the light off, right? To extinguish it, to quench that flame burning. No more fuel to keep that flame alive. So perhaps we just need to keep that in mind, that when we talk about enlightenment, we're like, yeah, the light comes on. But for the Buddha, he's like, goes out. Okay, so that's what we find here in the Ratana Sutta. And so he's talking about what happens when someone has attained enlightenment. And so this first line, dedicated to Gautama's dispensation. So this is, the dispensation is the teachings of the Buddha, and Gautama is the Buddha. It's another name for the Buddha, his clan. So these people are dedicated to his teachings, strong-minded, free from sense desire. Remember, craving is the cause of suffering. The ending of craving is cessation, Nibbana. They've attained the goal, plunged into the deathless amitta, and enjoy the quenching. This is nibutim, a similar word to Nibbana. Nibutim, quenching, putting out the flame, right? Quenching is like wet, and flames are hot and fiery, so you put it out by quenching it. And they enjoy the quenching they've freely gained. And later the sutta goes on to say, the old is ended, nothing new is produced. So remember I said before, there's endings, things disappear, they stop, and nothing more is produced. This is the ending of the asavas, the taints, the defilements, the outflowings. Nothing new is produced. No more karma, no more sankharas, no more things which perpetuate. Instead, their minds have no desire for future rebirth. And the simile he gives here, two similes, withered are the seeds. There's no desire for growth. So a friend of mine, he was a monk for a while, his name was Kina Bija. This is the words here. Te Kina Bija avirudhi chanda nibanti dira yatayam padipo. Withered are the seeds, Kina Bija. So he used to call himself the weed killer. Because if you kind of kill the seeds, then there's no weeds, right? Well, there's no flowers either. And so his name was Kina Bija. And this means that the seeds are destroyed, they can't grow. So the seeds for rebirth are destroyed. There's no future, there's no desire for future growth here. Those wise ones being arhats, fully enlightened beings, are extinguished. Again, this word is nibbuti. Extinguished. So of course this relates to Nibbana. Are extinguished just like this lamp, padipa, lamp. And so the image here, that final image, is that image of the flame going out. And elsewhere the Buddha talks about when there's no more fuel for that flame, it ceases. And when that flame goes out, it's gone. Where is it gone? Try to find that flame. It's gone. The conditions that fueled that flame have ceased. While those conditions were there, while there was fuel for that flame to burn, suffering continues, life continues. When those conditions have ceased, when there is no more fuel to burn, then that's enlightenment, and there'll be no future rebirth. And then when that being attains parinibbana, final nibbana, then they're gone. There's no future rebirth. So this is how the Buddha described that state of enlightenment. It's quite useful to think of the things that we do in our life create the fuel for our future conditions. So how we act, how we talk, how we think, this all creates the things that support us as a being. So when we stop doing certain things, we can expect certain results to cease. When we cultivate certain things, we can expect certain things to happen because of that. So what we're trying to do is to abandon unwholesome things, cultivate wholesome things, and purify the mind. And this is what will lead to cessation, to Nibbana, this process of purification. There'll be nothing left, nothing to go on with, gone, vanished. This is that simile of the extinguished flame. Next this sutta talks about enlightenment like a lotus flower. So here we have the first line, the realized one has escaped from 10 things. These are the samyojanas, the 10 fetters. These are the things that prevent us from being enlightened. And in the stages of enlightenment, the first 3 are overcome by the first level of enlightened being, the stream enterer. So there are stages of enlightenment. There's beginning level enlightened beings, and there's the totally enlightened beings. The lower levels are the stream enterer, the person who has seen through the first 3 fetters. That is Sakkaya Ditthi, identity view, embodied view of self, and doubt, uncertainty about the Buddha's teaching. If you've attained this view, you no longer have any doubt about the Buddha's teaching. Doubt is a fetter, something to be overcome. The third of the lower fetters is the adherence to rites and rituals, sila bhata paramata, to believe that these things alone are going to take you all the way to enlightenment. We see this in so much of Buddhist culture, people wanting to do the rituals. If we don't do this properly, it won't work. And so this is a tendency that we have to do things in this way, or that these things are somehow more important than the mental development. And if we only do these things, of course, we're not able to make progress on the path. Because purification of the mind doesn't happen through rites and rituals. So these are the first 3 fetters that a stream enterer overcomes. They're called a stream enterer because they get into the current of enlightenment. They get carried by that current towards extinction, towards extinguishment. It's like a tree that's falling this way, right? If you cut it, it has to fall down that way. It can't just fall back that way. So they're on the way. There's no return for them to lower realms of rebirth, such as states of deprivation, the apayas, like the hell realms or the animal realms. Because they've been so good, they've generated so much goodness and good karma that they're only bound for rebirth in the higher realms, and the human realm. So this means that within 7 lifetimes, the momentum that they have gained will cause them to attain enlightenment. That's why they're in this current of enlightenment, they're in the stream. It can only be that they fall towards enlightenment, and it might take 7 lifetimes to achieve that. But within that time, they should achieve enlightenment. So this is the first level of enlightenment stages, the stream enterer. And so all of our energy is directed at understanding this, at becoming a stream enterer. Once we get there, we can just relax, right? You're on your way. And so that's kind of all the energy that we need to put forth. And the next level is the once returner, someone who will return once to live a life again. So they've got one more lifetime to finish off their work. Then there's the non-returner. The non-returner doesn't come back to this realm. They may be reborn spontaneously in a heavenly realm and from there attain enlightenment. These 2 classes of enlightened beings, of Arya Sangha, they've overcome those lower 3 fetters, and then they're working on greed and hatred, ill will. They're not abandoned until that non-returner stage, which is quite a long way into the enlightenment process. So it's quite good to know if you've got a bit of hate in your heart, like, it's okay. Like, even an enlightened being has some ill will. They're not fully purified. So it's quite comforting, isn't it, in a way? So the once returner greatly slackens and weakens ill will and sense desire. The non-returner has overcome them. And then the last stage, the arahant, they have to overcome a further 5 fetters. And these are things like desire for a body, a fine body, a gross body, like flesh, desire for a fine material body, like the kind of body you have in the heavenly realms, and things like a sense of self, a conceit, thoughts of country and family and those sorts of things, restlessness and ignorance. So these are the higher fetters, and together these form the 10 samyojanas, the 10 fetters. And that's what this being has escaped from, so that he lives unattached, liberated, his mind free of limits. Here we're talking about the I must apologize, we're talking about something else here. But anyway, so these are formed, so it must be the lower, the 5 aggregates, and then rebirth, old age, death, suffering, defilements. I don't actually know what that list of 10 things is. But anyway, so we've skipped ahead a little bit. Suppose there was a blue water lily or a pink or white lotus. Though it is sprouted and grown in the water, it would rise up above the water and stand with no water clinging to it. In the same way, the realized one has escaped from 10 things, so that he lives unattached, liberated, his mind free of limits. Okay, so I probably should have looked at that more in advance. So those five things, first of all, form, feeling, perception, choices, consciousness, are the aggregates, which I won't go into. Rebirth, old age, death, suffering, and defilements. So anyway, list of 10. The next one talks about, suppose there was a house, a bungalow, with a peaked roof, with windows on the northern, southern, and eastern side. When the sun rays, an array of light enters through the window, where would it land? So this is also a kind of simile that the Buddha often talks about. The body or the form of a person is like a house. So he refers to this being as like a house, and we occupy this house. We've built this house. He refers to people as the house builder, someone who has built themselves a home, just like a hermit crab goes and grabs a shell. In the same way, we go and we grab a body. This becomes our home. We identify very strongly with this. And so the Buddha would often say of himself that he has destroyed the house. He's not going to build another one. This is a metaphor for for the body, for the sense of self. And so he's saying, when the sun comes and shines a ray of sunshine, where would it land? Where would it land? And so they say, well, it would land on the Western Wall. And the Buddha says, what if there was no Western Wall? Where would it land? On the ground. If there was no ground, where would it land? On the water. If there was no water, where would it land? Well, it wouldn't land. In the same way, if there is no desire, relishing or craving for solid food, consciousness does not become established there and does not grow. And so here the Buddha is talking about the things that sustain a being. And you might be surprised to find out that there's the desire for food there. Who's looking forward to dinner? So we'll go back to the front page, the sutra that I missed the other night. 4 practices that lead to Nibbana. So the Buddha says mendicants like a monastic, someone who's ordained. A mendicant who has 4 qualities can't decline and has drawn near to extinguishment, Nibbana. What for? A mendicant is accomplished in ethics, guards the sense doors, eats in moderation, and is dedicated to wakefulness. These are practices that lead to Nibbana, that are very close to Nibbana. And the same thing we see in the Awada Patimokkha, where we have a few sentences about not being interested so much in food and sleeping on not getting attached to comfortable beds and things like that, which is about wakefulness. So when we sometimes think about enlightenment, we think about meditation, we think about, this knowledge and insight, but the things that might take us there are going to be things like our desire for continuing bodily existence. How do we continue a bodily existence? Well, we need food, we need fuel for that. And so, without wanting to get in anywhere near eating disorder territory, the Buddha advises us to have moderation in terms of food. And that this is a way that we slacken that desire for the fuel that sustains a body. We slacken the desire for bodies. And then this wakefulness, we need to practice, we need to strive. We can't make a lot of progress in our sleep. And so this is why the Buddha encouraged people to rise early before the birds, to stay up meditating, and to really put effort into their practice. So these are things that perhaps when we think about it, seem like outside the realm of the Enlightenment experience, but are things that lead up to it. In the same way that ethics, our ethical conduct, is an essential part of the spiritual path. So often we find people practicing meditation paths without any regard to ethics. And they simply won't have good success in their meditation because they're not being aware of the conditions they're creating in their mind. You need that blamelessness where you haven't done anything wrong, haven't harmed anyone, haven't hurt anyone, so that your mind can be settled and serene without any echoes of problems from the past or guilt or shame. You can have this beautiful state of mind of non-regret, avipatisaro. You have no regrets, you're fine, you're cool, you're nice, you're good. And you have this anavajja, sukha, the bliss of blamelessness. And these are things that help you become enlightened. You feel good about yourself. You understand where pleasure is to be found. So all of these things lead up to enlightenment, help us gain enlightenment. And that's why here he's talking about fuel. And I won't go on in this sequence, but we're looking basically at dependent origination. And we're looking at the desire for bodies, bhava, the stages of becoming, how that relies upon contact, and how that stimulates desire for, greed for pleasurable experiences, and how that results in craving and clinging and so on. But we'll keep on moving. This next one is a very beautiful, very simple simile that reminds us that the enlightened one has gone. And so it's one whose defilements have ended, who's not attached to food. Again, right? Whose domain is the liberation of the signless. This is the animata, and the empty, the sunyata. Their track is hard to trace, like birds in the sky. Birds don't leave footprints, right? You can't find their trail. In the same way, an enlightened being doesn't leave a trace. Remember, they're gone. So it's a very beautiful, very simple way to see that. Yeah. Animata. Yeah, so that's a negative prefix, the animata. So there's no sign. Yeah. And the last one, a bit graphic, content warning. Butchering. Suppose a deaf butcher or their apprentice was to kill a cow and carve it with a sharp meat cleaver without damaging the flesh inside or the hide outside. They'd cut, carve, sever and slice through the connecting tendons, the sinews and ligaments, and then peel off the outer hide. It's a very graphic image, isn't it? It's a bit horror movie. You'd remember it though if you were listening to the Buddha. Then they'd wrap up that cow in the very same hide and say, this cow is joined to its hide just like before. Would they be speaking rightly? So this is how the Buddha often talks. So he's describing someone butchering a cow, removing its skin completely, and then it's a bit like the Silence of the Lambs, putting on that skin back onto the cow. See? The cow is just as it was before. Would that be true? No, sir. Why? Because even if they wrap that cow up in the very same skin and say, this cow is joined and its hide is just like before, still, that cow is not joined to that hide, right? So it's very formal kind of language, but we're just basically saying, you've skinned it, you can't put the skin back on, and that cow just comes back to life, you know, it's been separated. And so here's the Buddha saying, I've made up this simile to make a point, quite a graphic point, and this is the point. The inner flesh is a term for the interior sense fields, that's the sense organs, our eyes, ears, and things like that. The outer hide is a term for the 6 exterior sense fields. That's the sights, sounds, and those sorts of things. The connecting tendons, sinews, and ligaments is a term for greed and relishing. A sharp meat cleaver is a term for noble wisdom. And it is that noble wisdom which cuts, carves, severs, and slices the connecting corruption, fetter, and bond. So in the same way, an enlightened being has gotten over these sensualities that keep us rooted in samsara. This desire for sights, for sounds, for smells, for tastes, for bodily experiences. This desire for sensory experience, desire for pleasurable experiences, this is that kama tanha, that craving for sensual experience. And this is what needs to be overcome in order to attain enlightenment. To get all the way, we need to understand where suffering lies and where the escape from suffering is. So it's very difficult sometimes to understand why sensory pleasures are so looked down upon in Buddhism. And the reason is that these are very low-level pleasures. They're very gross. They're not reliable. They disappoint us. Even if you had your favorite food right now, you'd be made happy a little bit. But then if you don't get your favorite food, you suffer. Or if you keep getting your favorite food and only get your favorite food, you'll suffer, right? You'll soon become disenchanted with your favorite food. Sensual pleasures, the Buddha said, is like a bone that has been well scraped clean of the meat and given to a dog. That dog chews the bone, it gets the flavour, the taste of the meat, but it doesn't get any nourishment. There's no meat left on that bone. In the same way, we have these craving for sensual pleasures. We think that it will make us happy. We think it will bring us a lot of joy in our life. But these are usually quite underwhelming. We always want more. We're never satisfied. And this is the drawbacks of sensual pleasures. And it's our desire for sensual pleasures, that craving, that keeps us rooted in samsara. And so that's why here that image of separating the sensual, the outside world, the inside world with a sharp sword of wisdom, this is the ending of that connection, severing it. You can never put that skin back on that cow. In the same way, an enlightened being, they have overcome this attachment to sensual pleasures. And this is what makes them free. So these are some images of enlightenment. The extinguished lamp, the lotus flower that grows out of the mud and is unsullied by mud or water, that extends above that water. The bird's track, the severed cow's skin. This is how the Buddha talked about various processes, various stages of enlightenment. And so I guess these are some ways that we can understand a little about what the Buddha was trying to convey. So we're going to leave these ones here. I think when am I looking at? Oh yes, there's some more later on tomorrow about the good stuff. These are all pretty graphic and quite heavy. It's like the Buddha being really down upon food. What? Very sorry, Cynthia. You come here and you cook your best, and the Buddha's all like, whatever, just give me the slops, This is why sometimes being a monk, it's so weird, because our training is really to overcome this defilement of attachment to food, which is why we're not allowed to do things like cook for ourselves, cook the things we want. Could you imagine how happy a monk would be if they could just cook whatever they wanted? When people take us out to a restaurant, we just say, look, order whatever you want. We don't make the decision, When people say, oh, but does Bhante like this? We never reveal our preferences. Otherwise, we'll get stuck, always getting the thing that we like, always craving this stuff. We're not allowed to cook, right? We're not allowed to store food. So we don't get to keep, like when you put your leftovers in the fridge and you're like, oh, I'll have that later. We don't get to do that. Once we've eaten it, it's gone. We don't do any of the preparation that leads up to that moment of cooking, that thinking at work, oh, what am I going to have for dinner? That going for shopping, getting excited about all the yummy things, putting it together, that process of cooking, oh, yum, tastes good, doesn't it? So this is our training. It's not to say, Cynthia, that your food isn't important and wonderful and good, and I'm sure everyone here would agree, right? And so this is the path of the monastics. For lay people, of course, you need to be careful with food. Overindulgence in food can be a problem. But this is part of the training, right? For the monastics especially. And what happens when you become a monk is that your attitude to food completely changes. You have no control over it. And because of that, the excitement for food fades. Your enthusiasm for recipes and things like that, it's gone. So our attitude changes completely towards food. And the same with sensory pleasures. One of the things that I remember Ajahn Brahm talking about was the difference between having freedom of desire, going into Woolworths and seeing the dip aisle. There's like thousands of dips now. Like there used to be hummus, and if you're lucky, French onion. And now you walk in, there's like 1,000 types of dips. And it's like, whoa, which one will I have? And there's like 20 brands, different price points. There's a lot of freedom of choice, freedom of desire there. So that's one kind of freedom. The other freedom is having freedom from desire. You walk in there and you don't want any of it. And this again is something that I've seen in my life as a monk. We don't have any money. We can't go shopping. We can walk through the shopping centre, walk through the supermarket, and none of it affects us. We can't get it. And so we have no interest. But I remember when I used to have money to burn, not a lot, but enough, and I'd walk into a shopping centre and my little eyes would look everywhere. Oh, this thing, that thing. Go into the supermarket and you're like, I could have anything I want. You feel like you're the richest person in the world with $50 in your pocket to buy some dinner. And so this is a different way of experiencing the world, this freedom from that desire. So we work upon these cravings for things. So this is why the Buddha established the order of monks and nuns, so that there was a path for people to practice and methods for people to practice which help them overcome these things like desire for food, which sustains that craving, that fuel for future rebirth. And so I just mentioned this not to give anyone any eating disorders or to guilt you or make you feel shameful for having a life with good cooking and good recipes and nice things, not to shame you or make you feel bad at all. These are things that you are entitled to do, and you can enjoy these things in your life with wisdom, understanding their limitations. Well, I mean, good luck trying to sort that one out. But the point is to understand that these things have drawbacks, that they're not themselves forms of pleasure that are going to lead you to Nibbana. The other types of pleasure that we can experience are the pleasures of meditation. And these go above and beyond the sensory world. And so when the Buddha talks about pleasure, he talks about, this low-level pleasure of the five senses. He doesn't deny that there's any pleasure in the five senses. But it's a certain type of pleasure. It's limited. It's reliant upon sensory experience. Then there's the pleasures of meditation, joy, rapture, bliss, incredibly pleasurable experiences that we have in meditation that don't rely upon those external sensory objects to cause us happiness. And then there's the experiences of meditation that go beyond the body completely, when the five senses are completely shut down and the mind has no access to them. There's the deep states of meditation called jhana, where there's no experience of the senses. There's only the mind perceiving the mind. And these are incredibly blissful and happy experiences. So this is like way beyond, Doritos, or for some reason I'm obviously thinking about nachos, but anyway, and we're still not at the highest point of pleasure. Like the Buddha says that enlightenment is the best. It's the best kind of bliss. And so this is that range of pleasures that we're able to experience as humans. That we can experience this range of pleasure in our life. But if we're only stuck down here in the dip aisle of the supermarket, and that's where we think that pleasure is to be found, then we're not going to start identifying with the pleasures of the mind that are found in meditation, that lead to those very deep states of meditation, that will lead eventually to the bliss of Nibbana. And so this is why the Buddha talks about sense desire, kama tanha, craving for sensual pleasures. This is why the Buddha talks about things like food, or that pleasure of sleeping all day in a soft, warm bed. These are things that will prevent us from developing the kind of mind that will experience the kind of pleasures that take us away from that sensory experience to deep stages of meditation and eventually Nibbana. So that's why we monks and nuns only eat in one part of the day. That's why I encouraged you last night to just see if we can work with this precept, the precept of abstaining from the evening meal. No one's forced to. You can eat if you want. And it's useful sometimes to do that. Anyway, I've been talking for way too long. Let's have a little break. It's time for those interviews. Did anyone put their name down? I saw 1 person, 2 persons, 3 persons, 4, 5? No? Okay, good. So, yes, of course.
I don't. So I was brought up in a Jewish family. My children are Christians.
Okay.
My daughter's very worried that I'm not going to become a Christian before I die. And so, for her, if I was able to love Jesus and achieve a state of grace, she would be confident I would be in heaven with her. My understanding, so what I'm understanding here is that Buddhism actually inverts that and says, were I to attain enlightenment somehow, I would actually leave here with my love for my children extinguished. I would have become disattached from it. I would have compassion would have been extinguished because all it says feelings. I have no, I realize that feelings actually would not exist in Nibbana. Love would not exist. Compassion would not exist. And it seems to me that actually, you mentioned at the beginning that the Society of Buddhists were going to support the yes vote for the referendum, but it seems not those who have achieved enlightenment, because there is no consequence anymore to them. They become unattached from ethics. The road to enlightenment includes ethics. Once you're there,
you're not.
How am I wrong in that thinking?
Yeah. So the noble beings love ethics. They love it.
Noble beings.
Yeah, they love
love
ethics.
Does not exist in enlightenment.
Yes, it still does. So the Buddha was enlightened, but he taught out of compassion, right? So just because you are enlightened, you can. So, for example, remember that the Buddha was alive after his enlightenment. Yeah. So there's 2 stages of enlightenment. There's the stage where you're alive, and then the final enlightenment, the parinibbana. This is when the body dies and there's no future rebirth. That's the gone. But while alive, yes, full of love, full of compassion, practicing ethically, caring for people. The Buddha advised kings. The Buddha helped psychotic people. The Buddha helped reform mass murderers. He was full of love, full of compassion.
So love and compassion are not extinguished.
No.
They probably become stronger somehow.
Yes, because you have seen the true nature of suffering. So imagine seeing back to beginningless time, the suffering of people. This is where that great compassion comes from. People are messed up. We're messed up. We have a lot of compassion. May we be free from suffering. May they be free from suffering. This is how Buddhists see compassion. If only they could be free from that suffering, then they would be happy. This is a wish that we have. This is kind of like that state of grace you mentioned. So just remember that there's these 2 stages, these 2 aspects of enlightenment. Enlightened beings are still alive and practicing. And then the final extinction is when they die and are not reborn. Yeah, that's arahant. Yeah.
It was worrying me. So.
Yeah. No. Always ask questions. Don't hesitate. And we're going to have a chat now anyway. And everyone else, please continue your practice. Have a cup of tea, perhaps. Restore your energy. And at 6 o'clock, you have your evening allowables. And at 7 o'clock, we come back here. We'll do some more meditation, and we'll hear some more Dhamma. Okay, very good.